Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or good evening. Glad you could join us today. We'll wait a few minutes to let everybody in. You can say hello in the chat and tell us where you're from. It's been fun to see people from Johannesburg, Stuttgart, South America, Central America. And I noticed that my wonderful technical assistant has turned off my video. We seem to be having some unstable issues here. So I hope you can all see me. Kansas, New Mexico, hi Alicia from England, Vancouver Island, BC. This is so exciting. I love looking at where everybody's from. Hello, Grass Valley, neighbor. Hello, Illinois. I'm from Illinois, so I can say hi. Oh, Kingston, Jamaica, Iceland. Wow. Glasgow. Hi, Allison. Cornwall. Cornwall, UK, that is. Ontario, Canada, another one from London. Lots of Americans, Yorkshire, UK, Minnesota, Utah. This is so exciting. All right, well, I'm going to get started as the rest of you come in. Welcome and hello. Welcome to today's Textile Talks. My name is Nancy Bavor, and I'm the director at the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles. And we're delighted to introduce the presentation today of Weaving the Forgotten Women of Science into the Fabric of History. For those of you who are joining for the first time, Textile Talks is a weekly virtual presentation that is organized by 6 different textile organizations: Studio Art Quilt Associates, the International Quilt Museum, Surface Design Association, the Modern Quilt Guild, the Quilt Alliance, and the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles. Today's presentation and question and answer session will last about an hour. And if you'd like to ask a question, you can just submit it in the Q&A area on your screen, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. We're proud to be supported by the following organizations and businesses who make our weekly lecture series possible. They are Aurifil, Artistic Artifacts, CNT Publishing, eQuilter, Empty Spool Seminars, Handy Quilter, Misty Fuse, Motive Fabrics, Nine Patch Fabrics, The Quilt Show, P&B Publishing, Quilt Mania, and Schiffer Publishing. And I encourage you all to patronize these wonderful businesses and sponsors and tell them that you saw their logo on the Textile Talk that you enjoyed. And I also want to say a big thank you to everybody who has been supporting the Textile Talk since we started in April. And if you would like to make a donation to the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles, we would very much welcome that. And we'll put the donation link in the chat, or you can just visit our website at www.sjquiltmuseum.org. So this will be our last Textile Talk of 2020, and they will resume on January 6th, 2021. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Pantea Karimi has lived, studied, and worked in Iran, the United Kingdom, and the US, and presently master's degrees in graphic design and fine arts. And her multidisciplinary work investigates the intersection of art, science, and history through the study and interpretation of medieval Persian, Arab, and early modern European scientific manuscripts. Drawing from her life experience and the visual and conceptual elements from her research, she creates interactive installations and prints. She has exhibited in Iran, Algeria, Germany, Croatia, Mexico, the UK, and the US. And she is also the recipient of a very prestigious award in the Bay Area, the 2019 Silicon Valley Artist Laureates Award, and the 2019 City of San Jose Arts and Cultural Exchange Grant, and the 2017 Kala Fellowship Residency Award. And we will also be joined today by Dr. Kathy Zarur. I've been working on that pronunciation, but it's not perfected yet. Kathy is a curator, educator, and conference organizer in the San Francisco Bay Area. Her research areas include modern and contemporary Southwest Asian and diaspora art, museology, and the history of exhibitions. Kathy has curated exhibitions for the San Francisco Arts Commission, Minnesota Street Project, Soma Arts, San Francisco State University, and the Museum of the African Diaspora. She was the assistant curator of the 2011, and she has also organized several symposia, including Chinese Painting Here, Then, and Now in 2020, and Teaching Art of the Middle East and Islamic World in 2017. Her writing has been published by Art in America and Broadsheet. Zarur holds a PhD in art history and a certificate in museum studies from the University of Michigan. She teaches at the California College of the Arts and is the Carver Professor of Art History at Mills College. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Pantea and Kathy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy, for the gracious introduction, and thank you to the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles. And thank you, Pantea, for inviting me to be in conversation with you. Let's just get started. We're here to discuss your project, The Forgotten Women of Science. It was a solo exhibition at the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles. Can you give us a little background on that exhibition?
Yes, The Forgotten Women of Science was a solo exhibition earlier this year at the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles. It celebrated lesser acknowledged female scientists, some of them artists, suffragists, educators, or activists besides being scientists. I featured women from ancient times to the 19th century because this year we celebrate the women's suffrage centennial. My solo exhibition included 2 installations of embroidery hoops, which you can see on the bottom of the slide, and 200 bottles, which contained medieval medical remedies for women's health. The exhibition also had 9 fabric panels that introduced select scientists and 4 larger fabric panels that honored 100 female scientists across various times in history.
Wonderful. So how did this project come about?
Well, 2 years before this solo exhibition, I was invited to create a piece about the #MeToo movement for a group show called #TimesUp at the JJ Gallery in Sacramento, during which the Forgotten Women of Science project was born. My work in general is focused on medieval and early modern scientific manuscripts, mainly in the areas of medicinal botany, astronomy, and mathematics. Before this group exhibition at the JJ Gallery, I had looked at a few female scientists' works, but I did not delve into their life stories. The Forgotten Women of Science became a derivative project in a way that I felt an urgency to highlight some of these women's life stories as well as their works. This was, in fact, something that I did not anticipate.
So before we delve into the Forgotten Women of Science, can you talk a little bit about the artwork that you created in 2018 for the JJ Gallery exhibition?
Yes, for that group exhibition, I read about a few early female scientists. I was impressed by their stories, struggles, and achievements. Most of these women were also pioneers and generators of cutting-edge ideas. Hypatia of Alexandria's story caught my attention for several reasons. She was a passionate teacher and an accomplished philosopher and mathematician. She was also the advisor to the Roman prefect of Alexandria. But Hypatia became subject to criticism and violence and was brutally murdered. She's depicted in the School of Athens by Raphael. You can see her on the left side on the bottom, and I have put that enlarged section in my slide. In the artwork for that 2018 group show, I recreated a depiction of her face. It was important for me that she's portrayed in my artwork. And then her mathematical diagrams targeting her neck, I used that as a metaphor for her death. I also appropriated the Roman arch from the School of Athens and took the other philosophers, scientists, and mathematicians out and featured only Hypatia. But then to link the ancient context during which Hypatia lived, and today I surrounded her head with #MeToo and #Time's Up. You can see my artwork on the right section that I did the digital, illustration and the print on paper. So for my solo exhibition, Forgotten Women of Science at the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles, I started with Hypatia. She was the first woman I included in my series titled An Introduction.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this brief discussion of this one artwork shows that research is a very important part of your practice as an artist. And I know that you conducted research for the Forgotten Women of Science outside of the Bay Area. You traveled to MIT, you even went to Dublin, Ireland. So can you talk a little bit about that research?
Yes, you mentioned MIT. After the JJ Gallery exhibition in 2018, I had another exhibition at the Roach Library at MIT, where I created site-specific works based on the library's scientific manuscripts archive, which required me to conduct research. In the process of looking at the materials in the Institute archives and special collections at MIT, I came across a manuscript by Mary Ward, a 19th century Irish scientist and artist. Mary Ward could not go to university to train formally in science due to her gender, but she was persistent in pursuit of knowledge. She obtained information through writing to universities or scientists, asking about their published papers, and this is how she learned. She wrote popular works, including The Microscope, published in 1869. You can see that manuscript on this slide. All of the illustrated plates in this manuscript were produced from Ward's own drawings. On the slide, you can see the manuscript and some of her illustrations from that book. I particularly connected with her because she was an avid artist capable of rendering her research that she observed through a microscope. That just made her work even more special to me. I used her manuscript images in the other kind of embroidery installation at the Forgotten Women of Science. And then you ask about Dublin. In July 2019, I was in Dublin, Ireland, for the City of San Jose Art Exchange grant project working with Chester Beatty. There, I had the opportunity to research more manuscripts at the Marshes Library. I saw a manuscript called Lectures on Female Education and Manners by J. Burton, printed in 1796. Embroidery was part of conventional female education in the 18th and 19th centuries in England and Ireland.
So that's really interesting that your research led you to these two topics, science, of course, which was the point of your research, but also the social conventions and gendered expectations. And so how did you integrate those gendered expectations into your artwork, or the topic of gendered expectations?
Yeah, sure. I read that chapter from the manuscript by J. Burton, and I decided to include the text from the manuscript on the museum walls in my solo exhibition. You can see some of those texts in this slide on the bottom part of the wall. And I would like to quote Jay Burton from his manuscript here. I have already explained to you what are the proper employments of the female sex. The first I shall mention is needlework, the knowledge of which, as applying chiefly to domestic affairs, is absolutely requisite. And another quote reads, "It is a more pleasing sight to see a circle of young ladies busily employed in ingenious needlework, whilst one of them is reading aloud to the rest."
Yeah, so I love how this shot in particular, this installation shot in particular, reveals the tension that you explore or that you reveal in your artwork. So on the one hand, women are scientists and doing important foundational work from as early as the ancient times. And on the other hand, there are these gendered expectations to learn embroidery, for example. And I know that some of those women scientists were engaging in that work as well. I mean, we all kind of juggle all of those responsibilities at the same time. And I'm thinking, it makes me think about, how, this tension, how did it impact, or whether it impacted the historical record, whether or not women were included in the history of science. And I know that in your research, you have noted that there have been some inconsistencies, right? Inconsistencies in terms of the information that you have found about the scientists that you focus. So how did you incorporate or deal with the inconsistencies in the historical record in your project?
Yeah, it is interesting that you mentioned that, because during the course of my search about female scientists, I did find inconsistent profiles on some of these women. For example, information about their publications or other aspects of their life or work. In the beginning, when I encountered this problem, it just made it challenging for me to conclude my thoughts and ideas that I had for my artworks. But then I thought to myself that maybe I should draw attention to this difficulty of gathering authentic data on some of these female scientists. So I decided to bring it to my exhibition. And on some of the panels, part of the biographies are crossed out or manipulated with threads, of course, after confirming the accuracy of the information. For example, on this slide, you see a panel that introduces Trota of Salerno. On the bottom of the panel, you can see a section of her biography that is crossed out, and I have the detail on the right. And then in the four larger fabric panels called 100 Women, I also manipulated some parts of the information using threads. And that's the image on top. You can see a section of panel 1.
I see. That's ingenious. It's really great. Instead of trying to resolve the inconsistencies, you reveal and you highlight those inconsistencies. I love that. And
I thought it was important for public to know that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so I mean, clearly your project and all of your work is research-based, but I also know that in your personal history, there was also a tension in your years as a student between your interest in science and gendered social expectations of you as a student. Did that figure into this project? And can you talk about that a little?
Yes, my interaction with textile and embroidery started in middle school and continued to high school. I was a science student in high school in post-revolutionary Iran. We were all required to take home economics classes regardless of our areas of study or interests. In my generation, schools use rigid definition of gender roles to transform us to their notion of females who perform prescribed duties. However, here is important to mention and to note that women in my generation had the opportunity to also pursue jobs in most professional fields if they wanted that. But then this complex picture that was projected in Iran after the revolution, to me, was more similar to the life in in Victorian England than a conservative life in Islamic orthodoxy. This rigid approach at school, however, unfortunately suppressed my childhood interest in textile works because I saw it as a representative of the assigned gender roles, and I resisted the embroidery as a medium. But then I did not continue science after high school and pursued art instead. I come from a family of art lovers, and I'm really fortunate that from an early age, my parents encouraged my artistic interest. So changing my field of study at the end of high school came easy for me. And now the aim of researching scientific manuscripts for me is in a way to regain my science interest, but this time through the lens of art. And on this slide, you can see a page from a book in home economics course that demonstrate needlework techniques. And on the right bottom part, there is an image of an embroidery I did when I was 14 or 15. That's the only embroidery that survived from that time.
Because I was going to call you a master archivist. I'm really impressed that you still have this sweet bunch of flowers that you embroidered. It's really wonderful. And I also, I note that you said that you came back to science through art, and now I kind of want to talk about like how you came back to textiles, because I know that in 2007 you went to Iran and did some research there. Can you talk a little bit about that trip?
Yeah, 2007 was an important year because I went back to Iran after many years of living abroad. I rediscovered the value of Iranian crafts, particularly as it manifested itself in textile, fabric design, and weaving. For example, on this slide, you can see two well-known forms of fabric from various regions in Iran. On top, I have included termeh, which is primarily produced in Yazd and Isfahan provinces. And then on the bottom, I have pate, one of the most beautiful form of fabric and needlework from the Kerman region in Iran. And in that same time and during the course of my stay in Iran, I visited workshops and craft museums. I observed female weavers, and they were very engaged with the medium. Observing these women's work process, they seemed responding to their living landscapes, dreams, culture, history, and I felt like they're all weaving all of these into their, carpets, cleans, and fabrics. I guess these observations were transformative, and I became open to embrace the textile again in that sense. Yeah.
Wonderful. So now I'm going to put on my art historian hat and mention that, and it might be a bit of a jump, but I'm going to mention a mid 20th century art movement in Iran called the Saka Khone. And the reason why this is reminding me of it is because though, many artists at that time, we were looking to local visual culture and visual traditions as far as ancient times, and bringing those references and those images into artworks that we're also using styles that are associated with European modern art. So for example, abstract art, right? And so I'm wondering about, where you see yourself in that, if we were to say, that there's a line. It's not possible, right? Because, history and politics and migration and diaspora interrupts the possibility that, there's one line connecting one period in time to another. But I'm curious about how you see yourself and whether or not you relate to the mid 20th century work of artists in Iran.
Yeah, it is interesting you mentioned that, because I saw the Saghkhane artists' works back in Iran when I was the student of graphic design. And I remember that I found those works really invigorating and exceptional when I saw them for the first time. And now you mentioned about the Iranian craft, those Iranian art movements, such as Saghkhane, as you mentioned, encourage the inspiration from the Iranian craft and the use of craft, in fact, in modern Iranian art. So to me, generally, there were two approaches, either using a ready-made craft in the work or making it from scratch. I have an example on this slide from Masoud Arabshahi, who collaged a found embroidery into his painting. And he has a series of these paintings. While Monir Farmanfarmayan, another artist from the same generation, created her mirror mosaic pieces from scratch. She was deeply influenced by the Iranian visual culture. For these works, she was initially inspired by Shah Cheragh Shrine in Shiraz, and I have the image on the left side. And Shiraz actually is the city I was born, and I have visited this shrine, and it's absolutely magical. And then, like Monir Farmayan, I engage with all aspects of creating my art. I enjoy doing that, like from developing concepts, research, to understanding materials and media that I use. And then, like Farmayan, I also draw from traditional Iranian craft, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, and I want to say that what's exciting about your work and the work of an artist like Farmayan, who only just a couple of years ago passed away, is that though there is a direct link or an inspiration by traditional crafts, your approach to art making moves it so far away that you can't actually, it's not super obvious. And that's why I love having conversations like this. It's almost like, a studio visit, really, where we get to talk about these great ideas and underlying influences. And so I just wanted to, you mentioned earlier that you're trained as a graphic designer. And obviously you're trained in screen printing as well. And so do you see a connection between those media and batik and other forms of traditional fabric and textile printing?
Yes, as you mentioned, I'm a graphic designer and screen printer by education. In my works, I combine aspects of the two fields. For example, graphic design informs my interest in digital illustration and digital printing. And then I enjoy screen printing because it's capable of creating graphic images and it's a hands-on medium. For instance, I create all of my transparency films and stencils myself. My background in graphic design is helpful in creating transparency films that use digital applications. And then screen printing uses a chemical called emulsion and a UV light exposure machine to make stencils on screens. Using the screens I make for each project, I'm able to print manually on various substrates like fabric, wood, or metal. Now, you mentioned batik and other forms of, printing in Iran. I have to say that my passion for screen printing actually stems from my interest in batik and qalamkar textile printings, very common in Iran. Both techniques produce images on fabric that are detailed but yet very graphic, similar to what I can create using screen printing. And you can see examples of the batik and the process and qalamkar printing that uses some kind of a block printing technique. But then I studied the screen printing technique in England during my art studies, and then I continued learning more and using the medium after I moved in the US in 2005 at San Jose State University. Going back to the Forgotten Women of Science project, responding to Mary Ward's works and to create the other kind of embroidery installation, I found Ward's drawings appropriate for a screen printing process. Then I extracted images from her manuscript, created my stencil, printed on fabric, and then on this slide, you can see I'm about to deposit the ink on the screen I made. And the examples of the prints from that, printing process on fabric are on the right side of this slide.
Wonderful. It's so great to hear about your process and to look at photographs of you in the process of producing. Screen printing is so much more extensive than it looks. The finished product can seem simple, but clearly it's not at all. And I'm really glad that you came back to the Forgotten Women of Science project, and particularly this image is interesting because, I see that you're incorporating embroidery loops. And I find it very interesting that you in this, considering your feminist inspired rejection of the education in embroidery as a child, despite that, you bring embroidery into this project that's a reclamation of the contributions of women scientists.
Yes, I decided to use the embroidery as a medium because I realized it became a vehicle to express my feelings towards Mary Ward. I used the embroidery as a dialogue with her. I imagined, what if she would have stitched into her own images instead of those generic patterns that women embroidered in the 19th century? And then the wonderful pattern and texture in her drawings inspired me to use the medium in a free artistic manner, which made the steps even more exciting. My stitches are inspired by specific patterns I saw on Ward's illustrations, such as the animal hair on this side of the slide and the animal skin on this top part. And I try to kind of mimic these kind of like, forms that I saw on her illustration. And I have to say here also that Ward used a microscope to observe nature. So for me, the circle shapes of the embroidery hoops reference the microscope eyepiece and field of vision. It somehow brings her drawings into attention. And then the hues I used in my prints reflect her original illustration color scheme. And this is final view of the installation at the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles. I used 36 hoops to form this installation.
Really beautiful. I love the interactive nature of your work. And so now I want to ask you about one last part of this artwork, where you seek to fill the holes in the history of science by teaching us about women scientists. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I chose those scientists whose work I found remarkable for their time and situation, and their life stories were also very, very interesting. So I created a series titled An Introduction, which introduced 9 scientists, including Mary Ward and Hypatia, as I mentioned earlier. And then using images I gathered, I digitally illustrated these 9 scientists and composed the panels with their brief life stories and diagrams reflecting their scientific works. Here I have to say that many images of female scientists have not survived or are not suitable for artistic production. An example of that is Rufeida Aslamia, a nurse or surgeon from the 7th century. In my search, I couldn't find an image of her. So I represented her without a face and with some representative surgery tools. But then another example is Ada Lovelace. The relevant diagram and her image that I found both had low resolutions. I had to reconstruct every detail inspired by those photos I found. And now here are Mary Ward and Lubna of Cordoba, the other 2 panels from this same series and introduction. The layout of the panels and colors represent pages of illustrated manuscripts and scientific themes. But then I created all the 9 panels with soft hues and this layered imagery to signify their forgotten names in our current memories. And I digitally printed my illustrations on fabric at Color Art Institute in Berkeley. So I was really involved in the process of illustration and printing and learning all aspects of the media that I was working on.
I'm really moved by this, you know, your visualizing memory, right? And the way that history is written, you know, in ways that is erase, right? And so like you're bringing in the erasures, you're bringing in the faint memories, the faint knowledge, and you're visualizing it here. I'm really moved by that. It was really wonderful to hear about the forgotten women of science. And I think it would be great now to learn about a couple of other works that you've done so that we can understand what's the relationship between this project and some other projects. And so I'd like to ask you about one work that I've seen called Folding Gardens, A Stained Memory. I know that like Forgotten Women of Science was also research-based. You were looking at medieval botanical manuscripts, but also, again, you brought in your personal experience. So can you talk a little bit about that project?
Yes, in Folding Gardens was one of my favorite projects. And in Folding Gardens, A Stained Memory, I feature my research of a prominent Arabic medieval medicinal botany and tell a personal story of my childhood, growing up with the knowledge of medicinal plants through my grandmother and roaming around the tall trees of Shiraz gardens. And Shiraz is also the herbal center in Iran. So through this work, I also reveal how a pleasant childhood in Iran became interrupted and stained by the revolution of 1979. The installation uses my digital botanical drawings and prints on transparent fabrics with hand-stitched silk threads on the bottom of each panel. But then I started the project in black and white in 2007 during my Color Art Institute fellowship residency. The addition of the red fabric pieces in 2019, one with blood stains, symbolized my injury at school during the 1979 Iranian Revolution. I also printed these fabrics at Color Art Institute, and I was, again, very involved with the process of research and creating the drawings and printing.
Great. So this conversation is so rich. You know, one thing that stands out to me is you mentioned your grandmother was an herbalist, and so many of our grandmothers were. You know, they had the knowledge of the plants, right? What to drink, what kind of tea to drink if you have an upset stomach, right? It was part of the domestic work that they did. And so in that way, I'm wondering, you know, how and whether it was, you know, maybe written out because it was seen as, oh, this is just something that, you know, women do in the household. Not to go back to that, but actually I'd like to continue talking about folding gardens, a stained memory. I know that this project too involved a very extensive research process. Can you talk about the research you conducted for this work?
Yeah, the installation started by redrawing a few plants from that 12th century manuscript that I researched. I kept the rendition of the plants close to the original images because I wanted to revive these early botanical drawings. And then in this process, I grew some of these plants in my backyard to study their natural structure live. Yeah, they acted like my pets. Since the manuscript was written in southern Spain when it was under the Moorish Empire, which ruled Spain from the 8th to 15th century, I traveled to visit the region in 2017 as a means to create more synergy between me, my research, and the work I was producing at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So while I was working on this project, I have to mention that I also looked at a few other early manuscripts, such as the Greek De Materia Medica, and it was translated and illustrated by Muslim scientists in medieval times, and then some botanical works from women botanists who were also artists and illustrated their books, such as Anna Atkins and Ellen Hutchins. And all of these were very inspiring, and actually they played an important role in developing my own artwork while I was working on this specific project.
I love that you grew the plants. I mean, this discussion is really revealing the embodied nature of your research process, and I just love that. So to close off this conversation, I'd love to end with one concept design that you produced. I'd love for you to talk about this, which you did for the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto. And then also, yes, very dedicated. I know, I agree. And then also, I'd love for you to end with your thoughts about the relationship between art and science.
Sure. Here is a concept design using similar approach to folding gardens for the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto. With these installation ideas, I'm responding to the 17th century Persian carpet known as the Wagner garden carpet. The carpet depicts a traditional Persian garden called Chahar Bagh, which means a four-part garden where each of the four sections is separated with water channels. I have included an image of this carpet on the right corner. And to answer your other question, I have to say, yes, I do see similarities between scientific and artistic discovery processes. To me, both fields share exploration visually and conceptually. They use imagination and they communicate meaning. And then perhaps science and art are those fields that would and should include all genders. These fields require intelligence, creativity, or patience with the process, just to name a few. And by their nature, art and science to me are blind to gender stereotypes. And that's how I see both fields as side by side.
Yeah, I agree. So in that way, we could say that, you know, it's not that art and science are inherently gendered, but that somehow in the writing of history of art and science, women have been excluded. And I really appreciate your work here, Pantea. So I'd love to now open it up. I think we went a little bit past our time, so maybe we can open up for Q&A.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you, Pantea.
This is Nancy Bavor. I, of all days, have slow internet. I'm sure that's never happened to anyone who's on this call now. So I hope you can hear me clearly. Anyway, thank you, Pantea and Kathy, for that fascinating discussion. And Pantea, I just love your work. And I love it that you grew plants so you could sketch them, the real thing.
Yeah. Now you can ask me. I'm an expert now.
We did have some fascinating questions. Is there any evidence that some of these forgotten women of science ever tried to disguise their gender so that their work would be perhaps more accepted?
Well, my research in that area is incomplete, I have to say, but yes, for example, Hypatia of Alexandria, the scientist I introduced in my presentation, wrote a few papers, and in some of my research, it came up that she published them under her father's name. And there were other female scientists who published their works under either their husband's or their father's name in order to be accepted.
So yes, they did try and disguise. Okay. I'm also curious about the women too, about class and the leisure to do the exploration that they did. Did you have a sense of the women you featured in your exhibition? Were they commoners? Were they from prominent upper class families? Were they educated? Did they have some homeschooling?
Yeah, this is a very good question, because as a matter of fact, in this series that is called An Introduction, that I introduce 9 scientists and their biographies and work, I, in fact, included scientists who came from a noble background, so to speak, that they had a lot of opportunities, such as Mary Ward or Laura Maria Caterina Bassi, who was a physicist, or Ada Lovelace. But then I also included Mary Anning. She was a fossil collector in 19th century England, and her research became very, very important in the realm of how we see marine fossils. And she came from a very poor family. So in my work, I actually try to include women from different backgrounds, different times of history, and with different kind of works that they did, like in different parts of science. So that was one of my intentions.
Excellent. We also had a question. This particular exhibition does have human images in it. The one that you did of the forest did not. based on the attendees' understanding of Islamic religious issues, could this exhibition be shown in Iran with the human images?
I believe it would be okay because they are digital illustrations.
Mhm.
I haven't been in Iran for so many years now, and I probably have to go through a lot of, different, steps and rules, but I believe it would be okay to show those because they are digital illustrations rather than a photo of the person.
Yeah, and I would say, I would add to that, that the issue is more about representing God, right?
Yeah, or
More than,
saints.
yeah, or the saints, religious, important religious people. I mean, there's a similar approach to representing a God in Judaism, right? That which cannot be represented, right? It's so big that the idea that a God would be a person is ridiculous, as well as the concern around praising the image and not that which cannot be represented. It's a pretty complicated topic, and historically has been there's been tons of, for example, in the 17th century Iranian manuscripts, you will see many representations of people. So just wanted to insert that. Thanks for the
Thank you,
question.
Kathy. Yeah.
Thank you. Another attendee says, your work is beautiful, yes, but are there efforts in Iran to preserve and pass on some of the knowledge of herbalists like your grandmother and those traditions?
Yes, there are. There are many. And again, as I mentioned, since I haven't been living in Iran for many years, I'm not that involved in that process, in a sense that to know all the details, how such things are being preserved or discussed. But absolutely, yes. And a lot of Iranians to this date, they appreciate these medieval approach to body humors and health, and a lot of families actually believe in it, including my own family. And to this date, my mom always prescribes herbals when something comes up and I complain. Yeah.
I want to go back. There was a question about Ada Lovelace, because many people in Silicon Valley, where you and San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles are located, are familiar with her work as being foundational in scientific computing. And I'm curious, how did place, like where you have lived all over the world and where you live now, inform your choosing of which forgotten women of science you were going to highlight?
Well, I tried not to be biased when I was working on the project, because it was about these women and it was about them more than me and what I prefer. So on that note, I wanted to include women from all diverse backgrounds, women coming from different times, and women who worked in different, sectors, such as, chemistry, physics, mathematics. And the fact that I lived in Iran, England, and the US, all of these are coming into a big, part of my research and the way I see the world, and I kind of perceive my research project. So I have to say that Ada Lovelace, who was a 19th century British mathematician and writer, became important. Not only I'm familiar with British culture, but also because I live in the Silicon Valley, she became an important, character to include in my exhibition. I think living in the Silicon Valley actually mainly and in an interesting way initiated my research and my work going back to science. It really inspired that kind of, process to begin with anyway. It's another long story how and why, but then yeah.
And we had a few questions. I'm going to try and batch them all together. Many of the audience members are textile artists, and so there were obviously questions about your process. What is the substrate you use, and do you have silk screens? You showed your process of silk screen. Can you talk a little bit about the process and the materials that you use?
Yeah, silk screen is very versatile, and that's why I really like it. Because you can print on metal, wood, fabric, paper, anything that you really actually choose, even on plastic. But then the ink will change every time that you want to print on different substrates. You cannot use the same ink on various, substrates. But then going back to fabric, if you are digitally printing, you have to obviously accommodate the printer to the specific digital fabrics that are made for the printer. But then when I print on fabric using screen printing process, certain fabrics are better than the others. For example, linen and cotton, or some kind of a mixed fabric, 70% cotton and 30% nylon. Something like that is going to be better. And then if your fabric is not porous and is not too textured, you're going to get a more vivid image when you print.
Great, great. What are some of the next projects for you both?
Well, I'll go first. In the summer, I had an exhibition called The Unbearable Lightness of Mathematics. And it was an inspiring process when I started that project. So some of the artworks I'm doing right now in my studio are still relevant, and extension of that solo exhibition that I had in the summer, and they regards mathematical patterns and some medieval mathematical research from the Iran region. And I just pass it to Kathy. I'm sure she's working on some very interesting projects too.
Well, thank you. I see myself as a curator primarily, but recently I've turned to writing. So I recently wrote a short essay about the photographer Yazan Khalili, who is Palestinian. I'm working on an essay about Madiha Omar, who was the first Arab artist to integrate calligraphic references in a modern art. And I'm also in conversation about writing about Arab American artists in the Bay Area. So it's kind of shifted my focus to research and writing.
Great. Well, I look forward to the results. Thank you again, both Pantea and Kathy, for this great conversation, and to everyone for attending our textile talk today. We will be sharing this on YouTube and Facebook in a couple of days. If you signed up with an email, you'll get an email that it's now available. And if you enjoyed the talk and would like to support Textile Talks for 2021 or become a member of the museum, just go to our website, sjquiltmuseum.org. And thank you again to our sponsors for supporting us, and we look forward to seeing you in the new year. Happy holidays and all the best for 2021, and we hope to see you on our next talk, January 6th, 2021.
Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you.